All right, you ready for my outlier one?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So it's a Canton Court. It's not just players, right? Can I
wow.
Can I make it curveball? Yeah. I'm going with Mike Shanahan. And
so I know exactly the moment where this came up. We were doing a show the other day and you were mentioning Kyle Shanahan and you said his dad is probably a Hall of Fame coach. And I could hear the light bulb go off the moment that you said that.
That's exactly what happened. Because then I went, wait, he's not. 170 wins, tied for 13th. Okay, so all right. But let's list off some guys that he has more wins than Mike Shanahan. Paul Brown. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of him. Bud Grant, Joe Gibbs, Bill Cowher, Tony Dungy, Hank Stram, Dick Vermeil. He's 110 more wins than Jimmy Johnson. Yes, I understand Jimmy Johnson's NFL coaching career was kind of short. He did it right. But 110 more wins than Jimmy Johnson, but they have an equivalent win percentage and the same amount of Super Bowl wins. Okay. Nearly 50 more wins than Sid Gilman. Exact same win percentage. He's in the Hall of Fame. And I get it. That's AFL and all that. And
also Sid Gilman is in there for innovation reasons.
And
we can make a pretty good argument here.
There it is. That's exactly where I was leading to. So not only we talk about iconic for players and everything, and sometimes iconic with coaches and their personalities and everything, but wouldn't a guy that has his fingerprints all over the NFL for, really what teams have been doing for the past
30 years later.
Yep. And I think that matters. I think that matters a lot.
It absolutely matters.
Yeah. Dick LeBeau's in because of his, innovative blitzing schemes and everything. He got in as an assistant. Shanahan's offense with Alex Gibbs, the longtime offensive line coach. What everybody is doing right now, you can go back to right there with the 90s Broncos teams and everything that came after it. It was truly innovative at the time. People ran zone before and outside zone before. No one leaned into it this much and cleaned up all the rules and everything about it. Body types, what you look at for each spot. Rules of engagement, depending on every front that you go against, the bootleg offense and passing game that came off it, the play action innovations.
Well, that was the cool thing, right? It was the combination of the West Coast offense with the zone running scheme.
Correct.
And it's because he came from the Niners, right?
Yep.
And he was a Niners offensive coordinator at like the truest blue West Coast team that you could have. And then you combine that with what Alex Gibbs brought, and you got what felt like a new version of offensive football at that era.
And it was no one really combined that. No one fully leaned into it like they did and cleaned up all just the other stuff that came up with like usually when teams would go, well, you can't do that because, your offensive linemen are smaller and you can't drop back a bunch. Well, guess what? We're on a bunch of play action and bootlegs. No one leaned into bootlegs that much. They leaned into play action before, but not moving the quarterback that often and to tie it in with your run game that much. Again, the ideas, right, where everyone had similar or smaller versions of the ideas, but no one leaned into it that much. And the fact that I would say the last, not only just excluding Kyle Shanahan and his son and the other members of that tree, every offense runs some parts of what they were doing in the 90s, some little parts. And there's other coaches we talk about in this light. Bill Walsh, of course, is the epitome of it in the West Coast offense. NFL becomes a little bit like this, where everything gets distilled down. When everyone steals from each other, then the bad ideas get weaned out. Okay, that doesn't work against this now. That the meta is bad, so you can't do that now. Now, a lot of that base stuff that they were doing in the 90s, teams are still doing to this day, of course, with his son, but everybody in the league. Of course, everyone from his tree.
Gary Kubiak was an offensive coordinator in the NFL 2 years ago.
Right. Done. So you're talking about impact in the 90s, impact in 2000s, everything in the past 30 years. You can point to a lot that came from those offenses in the 90s. And so I just think his impact and the fact that he won games, it's not the, Air Corral, like that. It's not that where it's like, oh, he was really innovative, but they won games, but they don't have the titles. He did win the titles. And I think that matters a lot. And also just the players that got so much better under his tenure. That speaks to what they were doing as well. So I think Mike Shanahan should be in the Hall of Fame because it's kind of one of those, like, if not him, then what are we doing? Because of just accolades and fingerprints on the game. And that's what should matter when we're talking about the Hall of Fame. It should be the history book of the NFL, the history book of the game. And you can't write it without Mike Shanahan. And I think that it's so important, and that's why he should be in.
You don't have to sell me on this.
I know.
It's my favorite version of football. It's always been my favorite version of offensive football. And I didn't know it at the time, why I loved watching those Broncos teams when I was like 10, 11 years old. But aesthetically, I just love that version of it. And then, it doesn't really trickle around the league, it takes about a decade for the idea to hop from Denver somewhere else. And it's because Gary Kubiak and guys on that staff never got those jobs.
Yeah.
So then Gary gets the job in Houston in 2006, I believe, and brings the offense to the Texans. And then that's where you see kind of the second iteration of it.
Correct.
And the ideas were really similar, right? So Mike Shanahan goes to Denver in 1995 and brings that offense, kind of conceives of that offense over those first couple of years in Denver. In 2008, 2009, Kyle is the offensive coordinator for those Gary Kubiak Texans teams. Kevin Stefanski told me a story once where he was an assistant in Minnesota and they were doing like a off-season study. And he went and he watched all of the boots that the Texans ran during the, I think, 2009 season. And they were just insanely productive on those plays. And at the time, they were a West Coast team. Brad Childress was the head coach. That Brad Childress brought Kevin Stefanski to Minnesota. He didn't come from the Gary Kubiak, Kyle Shanahan tree. He runs that stuff now. But when he was doing that study in 2009, so 14 years after Mike Shanahan got to Denver, a decade and a half after the offense was introduced into the league, teams are still crushing people with it because of how sound the ideas were. And so as Stefanski's watching these cut-ups, he's like, this is amazing. Yeah. And he falls in love with it. And so like that version of football was so good and so sound and so effective that it kind of has this intoxicating effect that goes decades into the future. I mean, it transcends time almost. And I feel like that's why it's lasted as long as it has. And that's why it's still as popular in the current iteration of it as it is today. Yeah. And I love it. I just have always loved it. It's my favorite version of offensive football. And I think the guy who conceived of that absolutely deserves to be celebrated in the history of the league.
It was the outside zone, which is the basis of all of it, it's a run, meaning any scheme that you go against it on the defense, it has an answer to, but someone has to come up with those rules. They came up with the rules to make it work.